Hi James, good to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you, Deri. Thanks for inviting me along.
So we're just going to have a conversation. We had such an interesting conversation 2 weeks ago about what's happening in the state of digital transformation, what's changing because of COVID and the way that the world is changing, and what are the tips and tricks and the practical things on the ground that we need to do differently now. Um, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Some insights from what we've experienced over the years, what we've seen, taking that experience and coming out with some tips and tricks. So to kick that off, let's start off by saying I'm Deri. My name's Deri Jones. I work at Tribe, and we really work hard helping our clients make the most of digital transformation in a very hands-on, practical, on-the-ground way in terms of the customer experience space, maximizing customer experience for your end customers online throughout times of change. That's where I'm coming from. So, James, I know you've had we had a great conversation about your background in digital transformation, changing things, the leadership roles you've played. So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my background is quite varied, Deri. I've worked in a range of companies, from startup companies that I helped found all the way through to big global organizations like HSBC. My most recent role was I was CTO of a company called Larsa Limited in Leeds, which has around about 200 staff. And my involvement in the companies has varied. Initially, I was very much a hands-on technologist, dealing with the nuts and bolts, building quite big technology single-handedly. I progressively led development teams. And then when I moved into HSBC, the needle shifted significantly for me, because that threw me into a world where digital transformation was really gathering pace and the business had big
Yeah,
ambition. And I very much worked with the business in bridging that chasm between the business aspirations around digital transformation and the delivery of that through technology.
interesting. Yeah, we had such a good conversation um, 10 days ago that I was really wanted to build on that and continue that. Um, Such a lot of great insight you've got, and also such a lot of common things we've seen. So, last time we touched on that, digital transformation is a thing that's been around, but suddenly it's all changing. COVID is changing everything. The new economic outlook is changing things, and the requirement to speed up your digital transformation is changing. But often people misunderstand that and have got it wrong. And how can we get it right this time? Given that it is going to be different, it is going to be different this time. So, what are your thoughts on the challenges of handling it now?
Yeah, it's a very interesting time, isn't it? I mean, COVID is creating such a level of complexity and ambiguity with everything changing on a day-to-day basis, that I think on one hand, organizations are struggling to plan change and understand how they manage digital transformation going forward. On the other hand, they're realizing, particularly those organizations that have got it wrong, the shortcomings of what they're doing. So the impetus is there to transform, but being able to do that against the backdrop of complexity is the challenge that they have to contend with.
And it's going to be harder now with staff furloughed, projects delayed. You know, we work with sort of 50 major UK organisations, and it's tragic to hear on some of the projects how good work has been shelved. Some systems just days away from launch, shelved for now, and so it's going to be harder to unravel those and get back on some kind of a trajectory. Um,
I think that's right, but also I would say, Deri, having spoken to um, a range of different people, different business leaders over the past week, I think appetite is changing yet again. I think that initial phase of we're going to keep in a holding pattern and keep the lights on until the COVID phase is blown over has given way to a realization that the COVID challenge is going to go on for a lot longer.
yeah,
That ambiguity and complexity is going to be there for years to come, and the old normality might not come back. So what I'm seeing is organizational leaders ask the question, how can we transform? How can we continue with our digital transformation programs? In some cases, how can we accelerate our transformation programs?
Yeah.
With that complexity there.
I mean, it's changing fast. I'm thinking of some of our finance clients, some of our retail, and it's going to be a new world. So the thing that's interesting to me is you shared a fascinating story last time about your time at one of the big banks and how the possibilities of change and how to do it well. You let some really good some pattern. I think you call them patterns, but anyway, tell us a bit about that banking time and some of the patterns there.
Well, I've seen patterns and I've seen anti-patterns as well. But the first engagement in HSBC was definitely a learning experience for me, and I think maybe also for HSBC. And just to give some context, I went into the bank from a smaller company and was quite naive in my understanding of how a big organization like that worked, the politics. So the way that I operated wasn't necessarily maybe in the conventional way that people operate in that big organization. And I went into that organization, into a role, and the role disappeared as soon as I arrived for reasons I won't bore you with at this stage. So I found myself very much as a minister without portfolio, looking for something to do. So I spent a few weeks exploring that organization, and coming from an engineering background, I could see that one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest cost centers of building out technology in the bank was around the integration of new generation digital systems with legacy, typically mainframe systems. I also realized that a lot of the manual integration work that was happening in order to tie those systems together could be automated, and that it was possible to automate it in such a way that you could generate the code for the new generation system and the old generation system such that these would work together. And again, to cut a very long story short, this gathered pace through the bank until it was used globally across all the business lines and saved the bank many millions of dollars. Now, you asked me about lessons learned.
That's a fantastic story. I love it when somebody comes into a big organization and has some new ideas and doesn't get squashed, follows them through and makes a big difference. So that's really, I think it's a story close to all of our hearts. Yeah, brilliant.
I think the big lesson learned from that was one of being incremental about the way we went about it. So the way that the bank at that time worked was very much around big programs, big investment, big ambition. We initiated that activity and very much did it incrementally. We first worked with one project to prove out the approach and prove the value. We then went on to the second and then the third, and then grew out exponentially from that. And the philosophy that we took was very much around a small business within the bigger business. We had to justify the value of what we were doing to be able to substantiate and continue the momentum that we had. And that was quite, I think, a refreshing approach for the business, and I think gained a lot of kudos. That new way of thinking about change as a more incremental activity rather than a big bang activity.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, we see across our different projects, there's so many different ways of people doing something that they call digital transformation. Sometimes it's forced down from on high and it's just lip service, and 2 years later not much has changed. Other times they're taking your approach of let's start with something and prove it in a small scale and then roll it out. In both those occasions, I mean, you were able to find a niche, a way there of improving on the ground in the nitty gritty of how to automate, to streamline, to procedurize that process of change. And in some areas of banking, that's easier for, and others it's much harder. We have a lot of retail clients, and they've got a freer hand. There's less regulatory oversight, but again, some things are easier to to do that, and some are harder. But you talked about this pattern of starting with the business outcome, but juggling those two things all the time. We've got to juggle business as usual here. How can I get my hands into the picture? Oh yeah, business as usual here, and yet the new stuff here, the transformation here. We get involved often in that gap, so we see that a lot, where our technology and our approach is able to protect the customer experience of what you're serving to clients, of what is being delivered, the business as usual, while it's being sometimes fundamentally changed underneath the bonnet or on top of the bonnet by the transformation projects going on. Retail clients, we see people moving from one e-commerce platform to another, or upgrading from version 5 to 6, or bolting on all kinds of machine learning front ends to end up with a headless approach, and the entire front end is delivered quite differently from the back end data sets in a new way for the retail guys, or in the finance sector, the complexity of tools there. So that's a challenge to juggle. You've got to keep the business as usual going. You've got to keep customers happy. You've got to keep customer experience high, but you've got to sneak in the transformation as well. It's not easy.
It's not easy, and I think for me there are two parts to doing that successfully. I think the first part is to my example in HSBC, to approach the change incrementally. And I think there are two kinds of incrementally. One is very much a horizontal ground up. We're going to transform our legacy systems across the board. We're going to put in APIs across the board. We're going to integrate them across the board. We're going to build digital systems across the board. And I think
you mentioned APIs there. I want to talk about APIs. And
it relates to my next.
Misunderstood.
It relates to my next point. But for me, I think incrementally has to be around business value add, being able to build increments that have clear, tangible business outcomes at each step of the way. So rather than transforming the legacy, building a whole API suite, building all the digital systems, to do a slither of that is key to being able to keep the lights on and keep the rest of the systems running BAU alongside that transformation, particularly as having done a slice, you build confidence, you understand the lessons, the pitfalls, and are then able to roll that out across the organization, typically with increased pace in my experience. So having the right philosophy, having the right mindset to approach transformation is key. I think the second part, and it relates to APIs, is to use technologies to best effect. Because a big organization like a global bank has so many moving parts that to do one of those vertical slices may involve many different parts of the organization. And the question is, how can you work with these other parts of the organization, their technologies, without everyone standing on each other's toes? And API enablement is one of the best technologies I've seen used properly to being able to achieve that end and partition bits of an organization to facilitate that change.
APIs is a fascinating in my space of customer experience online. Make it fast for my customers, make it glitch free, make it smooth, make it consistent, make it fast, make it consistent. And one of the arguments from the API crowd years ago, everything will be on an API. The speed of every API will be measured. They'll all be fast. That guarantees a fast user experience. And of course, that's not true, because there are many ways in which the front end or the user experience can be held up with queuing things going on, where it's true that all the individual pieces are not breaking into a sweat, but it doesn't mean that the end user isn't experiencing delays, because everybody's got queuing all over their software these days, and things can queue unexpectedly and so on. So there's that kind of, APIs. At the same time, APIs are vital. You're saying APIs are vital. They're great. Separation of concerns, separate different teams can work on different APIs. I've seen in some cases inefficiencies result because nobody really knows what all the APIs are doing and how to orchestrate them all. So there's a huge market space there for MuleSoft and tools and orchestrating and you can build tools to do that. You can buy and build stuff, but somebody's got to understand all that and kind of join it together while you're working on it and to decide what to work on next.
I would agree. I think all too often organizations get into the technology of APIs too quickly and buy into the philosophy of having an API economy without really understanding what outcomes they're looking to achieve. And I think where APIs are massively valuable is being able to delineate responsibility and provide capabilities that add value are needed under some kind of contract, the provider client contract. And if that's done correctly, then you can design your API economy driven by the needs of the consumer rather than the aspirations of the producer. So I think if you view it through a consumer lens, then you can drive a very sensible API strategy that meets the needs of the consumers. As soon as you start driving it more bottom up from a systems technology lens, then you end up, as you say, Deri, with so many of these things, it becomes unsustainable with lots of different integration layers between them.
I mean, it's interesting. It's so often we start with the theory, we start with a good intention, we start with a good theory, like let's microservice this whole thing. We talked briefly last time about Primark, a lot of discussion on LinkedIn, Primark selling £650 million a month and dropping to zero because the stores are closed. And some saying that's a good business strategy to stay off digital. For them, it works well. Low cost items, the cost of returns will be huge for them, etc. Maybe they should never be a big online player. Other people saying you've got to be online. That's what I can't believe. Not a lot of people know this, but the internet in the UK started in Canterbury. That's where I live. That's why I moved to Canterbury 25 years ago, because it wasn't in London, it was here. And so for people to say you don't need to do it online, for me, is like, everything happens online now. You can't tell me it won't. But maybe Primark are the case, or other people just say they're just slow. They haven't got together. But I did hear somebody say, and I don't know if they knew this was true or not, but I heard that Primark had a digital transformation plan for the last 3 years. I was talking to some guys who said, yeah, I know the guys who had kicked off the advisory on that and kicked off the thinking. But as we know today, there is no online shopping with Primark. So I wonder what happened. I wonder how.
I think it was Warren Buffett, wasn't it, that said when the tide goes out, you can identify those that aren't wearing swim shorts. And I think that's absolutely the case with Primark. And I think irrespective of their view about the value of digital before COVID kicked off, I think that will have changed at this stage. I've also heard that they've invested significantly in digital. And my suspicion, and it is only conjecture, is that they've probably taken very much the horizontal ground up approach, and that they've been building capabilities and maybe have, a massive API farm, to your point a moment ago, Deri, waiting to build digital systems. And as I said a moment ago, I would very much advocate that companies don't do that, that they approach this much more from a vertical slice perspective, adding business value every step along the way, because I think that drives out the right patterns. You're ensuring that the investment is consummate with business need and so on.
So, in a sense, you're saying something that I find myself saying all the time, which is start with the customer, start with the user, choose a bit for them and change that piece first, but always start with them, not with what have we got at the bottom of this period. Oh, we've got some servers. Oh, we've got some API. Start with working back from the user and the use case. You call them Primark. I've always called them Primark.
I'm sure you're right.
You're in North Yorkshire there. I was born in North Yorkshire, even further north than you are, but maybe I've become a southerner in my days down here in Canterbury.
I think that last point is critical for me around driving this based on the business need. And over the past few years, I've become a great believer in being outcome driven. At a concrete level, using something called OKRs, which are objective key results, but it doesn't really matter. Understanding what the business outcomes are and helping the business think about their outcomes independent of technologies and buzzwords like API economies and microservices is key to being able to drive a transformation agenda that is adding value to the business and that can be measured against the business need.
So to summarize that, we're saying that digital transformation will be different now, post-COVID, different timescales, different budget constraints, different all sorts of things. But that same principle of focusing on the outcome and slice vertically by what will change for the user, what bit are we changing for the user, not which layer of the technology we're working on. I think those are good tips and tricks there.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, Deri, to know what the value is of the technology that you're using, to really drive them via the business outcomes rather than the
expand on that a bit. It's interesting. I'm keen for practical solutions, hands-on things that we've experienced, we've seen people get right or wrong, and can explain and steer people towards the better patterns. So when you say value driven, that can easily sound like management consultancy speak, and
yeah, sure.
when I hear that, it's normally because the customer's brought in one of the big four, big six, or however many there are, and spend a lot of money on highfalutin concepts, but not a lot of on the ground reality. So unpack that a bit.
Well, we talked about APIs a moment ago. Being able to drive APIs, the APIs that are going to exist within an organization based on the consumer needs of the business, of the digital systems, rather than the provider needs of what's available at those legacy system level. But another great example is microservices. And I've seen a lot of organizations implement microservices at quite a vast scale. And they've not really understood, I don't think, what the value is of microservices through the business lens. And microservices for the business give two core capabilities. One is the ability to scale parts of your application independent of each other. And the second business value add is being able to manage the life cycle of bits of your application independent of each other, and therefore release bits of your application independently. Now, in order to be able to understand what microservice journey is going to work for an organization, then it's important to understand the business aspirations around those two questions. What do we expect the demand to be around our application? How do we slice our applications into microservices to facilitate that scaling? How do we expect the business to work around changing the application, driving levels of increments and fixes to the application? How do we slice the application to be able to facilitate that? And if the agenda is driven based on those business requirements, then you can always answer the question, why do you have 12 microservices versus 1,200? Why do you have 6 rather than 6,000? Or why do you have 6,000 rather than 6? But often I find organizations are unable to answer that question because they have bought into a microservice philosophy and have just gone gung-ho on creating microservices out of every bit of application they can find. So there's an example.
I think this reminds me of something I was talking about recently about trying to, how do you structure your organization? How do you structure your teams? How do you, the challenges? And one interesting approach is to focus on minimizing the cognitive load of what we all do. We've all got to remember so much stuff to do our jobs. We've all got to remember some of it we need to have at the tip of a finger. Some of it has to be, 2 seconds away. Some of it has to be easily found, 20 seconds away in the wiki or somewhere, or 2 minutes away in the wiki. But And so looking at, particularly when you've got multiple technical teams, multiple delivery teams, and let's face it now, I can't think of any of the projects we work on where there's not loads of delivery teams. You've got the client's in-house team, you've got everybody's using some level of outsourced specialist guys to helping them on some part of their technology or their software suite. You've got guys like us in there protecting the customer experience, but working really closely. There was a nice video we did a couple of weeks ago with the gym group talking about how their different suppliers, ourselves, KPS, and the gym group's team together worked on doing some great, transformational stuff and got some stuff out the door that really made a difference. So you've always got lots of teams. You've always got to worry about communication. How do they talk to each other? How can they share the information? How can they understand the scope of all the microservices and what other people are doing with them, and where else people are adding to them? And so that principle of minimize the cognitive load for this stuff, if you take that on board, then that's like the canary in the coal mine. That will immediately die if you start having hundreds of APIs, because hundreds of services, because it's like this isn't manageable in any one person's cognitive capacity to have so much of so many here. You can group them, you can chunk them, and all those other good ways of making things learnable. But it's hard to avoid that. I mean, I find the same if I'm doing something complicated in a spreadsheet or whatever. Sometimes you come back to it a month later, and what was that? Why was I doing that formula like that? What was that? That could have been done simpler, couldn't it? So in the microservices world, it's hard not to end up too complex. That's the Medusa. You've got to keep fighting, chop one head off, and another 3 grow. One thing I'm seeing, one thing we're seeing, and my teams are seeing across the retail space, you've got big e-commerce platforms, the Hybrids and Demandware that are being bought up by the SAPs or the Salesforce Commerce and so on. And there's a new breed, new brooms coming in who are lighter weight, big commerce tools and big commerce, so on. And some of those are pitching themselves very much as headless. It's all services, guys. The front end, whatever you want to do over there, all we're giving you is services. That's it. And that's attractive. Kind of at the same time, you realize you're then hamstrung by the services that they're giving you from their big monolith, because you don't control what you add to that. So sometimes it can be a straitjacket. You bought into a better platform, and it does the things you wanted better, but actually some of the things that you used to get benefit from aren't done as well, and you can't go back in and change that because you've given it to the new guys. But at least there's a hope there that they've laid out their services, and they've got a pretty good set, but haven't overloaded it. I guess you need to bring somebody in and audit that and just say, is this covering the stuff? Back to the business vertical cases again. Do these line up?
I think so. I think that there's a utility of having off-the-shelf approaches, because I think directionally they can help inform the direction of travel. But fundamentally, the off-the-shelf approaches are the amalgamation of lots of learnings across different enterprises. And while no organization is so unique, special, and different, there are key aspects of an organization that need to be understood, and dimensions such as APIs and microservices journey based on the needs of that organization rather than on an extrapolation across a lot of different industries. So I would very much advocate using those kind of approaches to help inform and make decisions and help understand an organization's needs, but not to be used blindly as a canonical way of transforming an organization, because you would, I expect, end up with a lot of stuff that is not what you want in the first place, doesn't quite work in the way that your organization needs to work, plus a lot of other stuff around the edges that is redundant and you'll never use because it's just not within the frame of what your organization needs. So yeah, absolutely have some utility, but we've got to be very careful about blindly following these approaches.
I think that's a great place to try and bring things to a close, because blindly following approaches, that summarizes so often what human organizations end up doing, particularly managers who come in with a new approach, a new idea, and yeah, let's have that as a mantra. So it's been good. We've talked about digital transformation. It's changing. The devil's in the detail. It's what bringing the insight of the past to make practical, experience-driven insight into situations. So that was a great conversation, James. I really appreciate that. I'd love to talk to you again, and we can swap some more North Yorkshire humour if we do. Thanks for your time, and let's do it again.
Yeah, look forward to it. Really appreciate you inviting me along today, Deri, and I've enjoyed the conversation immensely. Thank you.
Great. See you soon.